So thank you so much for having me today. First, I'll ask who was in here for the last working session over lunch? You want to do hands? If you need to stand up, shake it out, or go by the air area, feel free. I know it's a long day with a lot going on, and it's really wonderful to have you here. So, as Nancy said, I'm with SmartGrowth America. We're a national nonprofit focused on advancing our North Star, which is a country where no matter who you are or where you live, you can enjoy living in a place which is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And we're an organization with an opinion, and the way that looks to us is a fantastic and affordable home in close proximity to much needed services, well connected with transportation, civic resources, jobs, and recreation. I'm really excited to have had the opportunity to get a better sense of all the policy, innovation, and work in Maine, both at a high level through regular coordination with Nancy and Brooksmart, but also through preparing for today and enjoying the sessions today. As Nancy said, I'll be focused on land use, growth housing work, and climate adaptation, which is an area of interest for me. So first, I know Maine is a small state, and many of you, or many folks at the conference, know each other, or you've run into each other. 2 degrees of separation max is what I hear. So I'll share something personal about myself first, which is, what really got me into this. I was a planner just getting started, actually had the opportunity to work with Tom Lowe, who presented this morning, in a lot of post-Katrina recovery work. And so this was an incredibly intensive, emotional time to see the extent of really tragic devastation in towns across Mississippi, Louisiana, and of course New Orleans. And for me as a relatively young practitioner, it was a really eye-opening experience to see both, first the extent of devastation, the extent of passion and love for this amazing city and its really strong culture. If that's where you're from, you're not going to find something that's special really anywhere else. Then also seeing the extent of federal government and planning dysfunction and the intersection between racist and discriminatory land use and housing policy and this really terrible weather event, which at the time no one was talking about as a climate change influenced event. That was not part of the dialogue, at least in all of the different planning processes that we were a part of. So working at that time really motivated me to try to be a part of policy change for both equitable housing, land use policy, and preparedness for climate events. And I think in the 20-ish years since that event, we've had a lot of really positive progress as a society, increased recognition of the extent of the climate crisis, and looking at all the work in Maine. I was impressed and excited to have the opportunity to dig into your climate action plan, preparing for this presentation and for just getting to know the environment before coming to the conference. So that I think has been a positive as went from Katrina to Sandy about a decade later. At that point there was more recognition of the role that climate change plays, more of a recognition of the extent that landscape and natural environment planning should intersect with planning for housing and for urban development and housing patterns. So yeah, and as I said, increased recognition for the need for climate action, including here. And so as I was thinking about what's a good productive use of 45 minutes, especially right after lunch when folks have either been here all day or you've been out doing something super fun and now you're back in a room, was trying to think how can we kind of galvanize and take advantage of all the different perspectives here and frankly all the passion here. I've been really impressed as someone who works nationally to see that a conference like this is pulled off in a pretty grassroots fashion with folks coming together from all these different disciplines working in the built environment and housing. So I learned that the climate action plan is in the midst of an update. There is a chance to give your input and to develop some ideas here which could actually go into the revisions. So for me, when I took a look at the climate action plan, I could see, there's a huge amount of progress in a number of areas. We heard about the community resilience partnerships this morning. I was really impressed to see the extent of investment in heat pumps, other energy efficiency innovations. But there's not necessarily a lot in the way of looking at land use and how does land use lead to potential for emissions reductions. And it's not just about driving. This is an image from a report SmartGrowth America put out a few years ago called Driving Down Emissions. Looking at the actual driving as like the tip of the iceberg, as you think about the environmental impact of being in a car-dependent environment where folks have to have a personal vehicle to get to jobs, civic amenities, school events, etc. So I mean, I think when you look at car dependency, is really not just a transportation issue, it's a land use issue. How can you bring more uses and more much needed services to locations that are well served by transportation where it's easy to get around? And this, I think I really feel passionately about this in terms of all the quality of life benefits. I live in Montpelier, Vermont, which is a really thriving downtown with a ton going on. And to be able to walk, run into people. I see Tom in the audience who talked this morning about, what's your term? Is it the chance interaction? Yes, okay, I'm glad I got the term. But you know, the opportunity for building a stronger community by running into people in serendipitous ways. But I think this isn't all a feel-good story here to talk about land use and climate adaptation. Again, I'll share a personal perspective that my perspective as a downtown resident changed a lot. Sorry, but who knows if this is working? Hopefully you can hear me. Changed a lot this past year when Vermont had really devastating flooding in July 2023. And I'll also note, not to put you on the spot, a colleague from Vermont's Department of Housing and Community Development, Jake Katharine, is in the corner, who's a mayor of Barre, Vermont, which experienced significant devastation, as did Montpelier and a number of towns and communities across the state. And so, personally, I had done a lot of work in post-disaster environments, but it's very different versus experiencing it yourself. Seeing all your memories kind of piled up on the side of the road, soaked through. Seeing your kids, you know, walk around, and this is a place that I hope they didn't take it for granted. I hope they appreciated that it's special, but suddenly is gone. So here is it's a phenomenon that I know you have here too. Beautiful historic settlements with a lot of cultural value, economic development value, nestled right up against riverfronts, which, you know, it all makes sense why they were there historically, but now they're really increasingly at risk. So where are we today? What are the challenges that we see at SmartGrowth America? I think a key one is, first and foremost, we're in the midst of a housing access crisis. There is not enough housing nationally, and especially here. But next, you know, the climate crisis also puts so much of our housing stock and the communities at risk, and discriminatory planning policy has put historically marginalized communities at more risk through, you know, no fault of people's own. And then finally, there's this dichotomy where the private sector, I think, is increasingly recognizing climate risk as a financial issue and factoring that into development, real estate decisions in a more proactive way than kind of your typical household might be. And then finally, we heard this morning about the potential for future migration, and that is also an equity issue where it's, you know, people with more professional mobility and choices are more likely to be able to move to a location where they foresee less climate risk in the future. So I'll run through a few stats, but I think from seeing the dialogue throughout, I know this is an audience where you all know this to the core. Hopefully it's just good to have the deck for the future and it's all being sent out by the organizers. That, you know, again, we're in the midst of the housing access crisis, and looking at the stats in Maine, I know them well in Vermont, but Maine is really up there with some of the environments with the worst housing affordability stats and extremely low supply. So just a study last week looked nationally state to state. You can see New England's pretty much all this extreme dark blue, where the appreciation has gone up, you know, close to 10% year over year in Maine over the last couple of years. And then, yeah, reading the stats where Maine's estimated to need about 80,000 housing units by 2030, but where are these units gonna go, and what's the policy environment that you can put in place to support these units coming online in locations where people can have a great quality of life, you're relatively protected from future climate events, and you're actually able to get the projects through. And then meanwhile, I think where we're seeing growth nationally is often in environments with less of a regulatory burden than you have here. So Arizona, for example, you know, there was a news earlier this year of housing being permitted when there's uncertainty of the future water source. I'm glad that's not the environment here, but I think you look at the national housing market, that is a thing which I think will then potentially drive more migration or growth pressures in areas where that's less of an immediate concern. And I think, again, the speaker this morning talked about this concept of climate havens, climate-proof Duluth. I think, Vermont's widely cited as a climate haven, and then it's cited that it's been debunked because of major floods. But to me, everything I see about that seems really a marketing term. If a mayor is saying, oh, we're a climate haven, or the head of sustainability says, come here, I haven't really seen that in any of the locations we're working in actually backed up by policy to make it easier to develop more units and to develop more affordable units and support affordability for people who have been there for a long time. So looking at some of the other problems that we see trying to tackle this in the federal environment, there's both the need for investment and supporting community members who've been in at-risk locations for a long time due to racist and discriminatory planning policy, and there is a need to support more housing in locations which can endure and support growth for the long term. And so, I think there's a lot of data out there looking at how extreme heat risk and flood risk are both more severe in formerly redlined communities. And then that also overlays with a lack of investment in parks and other really much needed civic and green infrastructure facilities. And then, bringing that back to, I think, further inequities when the private sector is really looking at climate data and future climate risk as a key consideration for future development. So moving from having shared a little bit of how our organization sees these issues, I have a couple of policy solutions which we're seeing in different locations nationally. Hopefully it has some relevance or sparks ideas here. And then I've got some discussion questions to get a sense of everybody's engagement on these topics. And then you'll have an opportunity, if you want to stick around for more of a working session, to brainstorm around what opportunities you see to be more proactive about climate adaptation and land use in a climate action plan and otherwise. So I think our fundamental problem statement here is that we're seeing housing as extremely difficult to develop, and I think this is a challenging development environment here. And then it's hard to build anything, let alone building in locations where there's potential for really high quality of life and potential to design in a way that can help people be at less risk from climate events. So our goals as an organization are to both support directing future growth out of harm's way and to support communities that are at risk. And ways we are seeing to do this are, first, this whole idea of climate-informed zoning, which really has to move forward at the local level, but there can be state-enabling legislation supporting this. Strategies to work in partnership with the private sector, in which the private sector is supporting investment in more infrastructure that can then kind of unlock more development value. And then some state-level approaches. So I'll share a couple examples, see if they're relevant here. One is we did a study on the fiscal impact of what we called climate-informed zoning in Norfolk, Virginia. This is widely known as the first, amongst the climate adaptation nerds, the first citywide approach to embedding climate data and climate adaptation in zoning as the kind of organizing principle, as opposed to in a couple say, flood preparedness overlays. So this creates sort of 4 zones of the city, looking at both investment value and opportunities for housing and looking at risk. Makes sort of a proactive approach to direct growth to locations which are comparatively at less risk. Keep in mind, Norfolk gets extremely at risk nationally to subsidence and sea level rise issues, but because of the federal military presence, there's, I think, more of a ability to invest in infrastructure. And then it seeks to direct development away from locations which are more flood vulnerable. And I think what we found interesting looking at this is we did a study of how the implementation of this climate-informed zoning, how it overlaid with property value changes, and actually saw next to no impact. So that's a really boring headline, but I think it was a positive headline in that the city went ahead and put policies in place which recognized that there was risk in parts of the city, and this didn't lead to a huge fallout, which is what a lot of the fear was in terms of the engagement process and the process leading up to the implementation of the comp plan and the zoning. So that's, again, the market dynamics have been a bit, there's been a lot of other factors in play since the pandemic, so I think it'd be great to do that study again in about 5 years. But for now, we found that to be a helpful touch point to see it's possible to put this kind of policy in place without a real struggle at the household level. And then finally, I'll put Jake on the spot too. We did a study this past year for the state of Vermont looking at their designation program, which is a really incredible program which provides technical assistance, capacity building, access to tax credits to historic settlements, towns, villages, and also new developments that are seeking to be compact, mixed use throughout the state. It's great to see the map of the number of communities here that have engaged with the community resilience partnerships. This is a similar scale where communities across the state are working together in partnership with the Department of Housing and Community Development to support place-based interventions. So we helped them look at how to streamline the program and also what the options were to make this program more explicitly pro-housing and climate adaptation focused. So this is a program that's been around about 25 years, has its origins in more of a historic preservation, economic development oriented environment, and now looking forward, recognizing that downtowns are a great place to live, a place where you can have less reliance on a car and have a high quality of life. The program is ready to be more housing oriented and to support climate adaptation. So some ways that it's supported, or that we hope it will support climate adaptation, this is all part of a sort of mega land use bill, which is on the governor's desk at the moment. So to be determined what happens there is expanding the tax credits program to focus on resilience, some synergies with what I heard this morning around weatherization, tax credit opportunities, targeted technical assistance for flood resilience. I think something that we saw in Vermont after the flood was that many of the downtown organizations really stepped up when all of the businesses were in crisis mode, and providing that, sort of formalizing that capacity type support role where they were really helping businesses navigate, but more importantly, be more prepared so it's not such a crisis in the future. And then finally, developing more strategies to align the boundaries, looking at climate data and vulnerability. So that was a way where the state was seeking to more proactively address climate action through this existing program, which has already had a really robust framework in place. So with that, those are a bunch of ideas. I would love to turn it over to you soon to hear, both hear from you and also encourage everyone to take some time to think about how climate adaptation and land use can come together in the next iteration or the updates of the Climate Action Plan. So folks can get to know each other across the tables. Here's some hands up kind of opportunities. So first, I'm just curious to hear, everyone's here from across the state, some people from historic towns, Portland, or larger environments, suburban environments too. Would love to hear which climate hazards are most directly relevant to the work you do or where you live. So let's do hands up for which hazards are biggest risk to you? No need to limit yourself to only one. How about increasingly frequent and intense storms? Okay, so pretty much everybody's concerned about this. Coastal flooding? Yep, everybody, okay. And state, this is not surprising in this state. Inland flooding? Yep. Impact to agriculture or fishing? Okay, so still this shows that I think this conference is awesome, how it brings together people who are working in all types of urban and rural environments as well. How about the impact to winter recreation? That's a big also economic development issue, similar concern in Vermont. And summer heat, which maybe everyone should put their hand up in this room right now. Is anybody not concerned about any of this? None? Okay, so there we go. Now I'm curious to hear if climate adaptation or mitigation is a part of folks' day-to-day work. So is this a key focus of folks' job? Okay, we have a number of people, kind of it's like a U around the edges, a lot of climate-focused people. How about sometimes, time to time, project-based? Okay, yes, maybe half the people sometimes. No, but maybe you care about it, you're trying to advance it as you can. We have a few people. And then does anyone feel like it's really not an issue at all for you? Yes, there's a couple people where it's not really part of your day-to-day. I know we have folks from a really cross-disciplinary range of professions here, so I'd love to hear where your organization is. So who's kind of just starting to look at climate in a work perspective for your projects? Okay, a few people. How about, are you at a point where you have baseline data? You're working with it, some other people. How about who's already has goals and you already have a strategy to meet the goals? Okay, so that's probably half. And then, is anyone here confident that you've met or exceeded your climate goals? Okay, we have one person, so we need to hear from you. And then stepping from, I think especially in a state like Maine and similar in Vermont, I know many folks wear two hats. You got your day job and then at night you're on a council or have other civic responsibilities. So would like to hear where your communities are at. So how would you characterize prioritization of climate action where you live? First, for anyone, is it just not really a priority? So that's, this is in another state that would probably get a couple hands. How about some initiatives, including some pilots? It's maybe a quarter of people. Work is underway. And then how about you see your community really taking leadership? So with that, we have about, I think, 15, 20 minutes for folks who'd like to use this time to get together on ideas. I'd love to, kind of circulate and hear from you all what synergies you see between your work and the priorities of Maine Won't Wait. I also was excited to hear that there is a land use, I forget the correct nomenclature, whether it's a committee or subcommittee or working group, but there is a new land use group which is providing input, and all the meetings are public, so this is a really good opportunity to brainstorm ideas and to send them through, at the point where they're accepting public comment through, I believe it's the fall and early winter. And then how can this, this group, Building Maine, this group that's passionate about housing, architecture, community design, community building, be a key part of addressing the climate access crisis. So with that, I'm gonna, feel free to make some groups, hopefully from the hands up exercises, a little bit more about what folks around your table are into. And thanks so much for joining today. And I'll be here too, so yeah. Cool.